Hello, people. I'm joined here with Ahilleas and Kenneth, and then we're going to be looking a little bit at a few lines from Milton's Paradise Lost. So, Kenneth, please take it away.
Yeah. Um, the course that I'm doing on Paradise Lost, I've called it Unlocking its Expressiveness in Rhetoric and Language on 17th Century Terms. And the unlocking part is quite an integral part um, of the course, as in Paradise Lost, we are uh, all the time we are confronted with very large constructions of text that demands things from the reader that we are simply not used to in the present day. And here we're looking at the famous invocation of Paradise Lost, that is the introduction to the poem, where the narrator, poet, or hero steps forward and calls on the muses for inspirations to start um, the grand epic. And we can look here, there's quite a few lines involved in the invocation, but there are actually only two sentences, grammatically speaking. And the thing about these kinds of construction is that they were commonplace for learned people like Milton and people with his background. They read this stuff every day. And we can see that the first sentence is incredibly long in itself. And if we lose track of where we are in that sentence, the poem quick starts to fall a bit apart in the sense that we can see, okay, it's interesting, it's kind of cool what it's about, but the kind of what is it? It very quickly for many readers just descends into a kind of random stream of interesting lines that are very hard to really grapple with. And an important part of this course is that we're going to look at Milton's constructions, and we're going to see that how we as readers can start unpacking them, rather looking at them a bit like we were a 17th century learned individual. Um, but here we have two sentences, grammatically speaking, but content-wise, there is only one sentence. If we look at sentence two, it starts with, and chiefly thou, O Spirit. That could simply just have been preceded by a comma.
Hmm.
So in essence, this is one single continuous sense or utterance of meaning. And if we start losing track of where we are, then then that's also going to severely impact our ability to really grasp the text, even at face value, let alone starting to try to interpret it.
And you can't appreciate
Um,
what you cannot grasp.
no, um, but we're not going to look in depth at the invocation today because I'm going to dedicate an entire lesson to this. But this will be one of the starting areas of focus for me is to enable um, you to read these texts and to be able to orient yourself in these constructions. Now, what one thing that really sets this course apart from a traditional course on Paradise Lost is that the text is usually just approached as, well, a text, some kind of poetic prose that you read through. But that view of the text is very different from how a 17th century reader with Milton's background would have looked at this text. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the punctuation involved.
Hmm.
So here we can see that Milton uses quite a bit of variation in where he puts punctuation and where he doesn't put punctuation. Um, and this is important because today we use punctuation differently than what Milton was doing at that time. And today we generally use punctuation to show grammatical information, relationships between content in the text. This is not really how punctuation was used in Milton's time. It's what we call rhetorical punctuation. So that the punctuation you're seeing is closely related to the natural utterances and pauses of actually performing the text. And here it's also, I guess, good to remind the reader that Paradise Lost was not composed as a text. It was composed as speech
Mm,
by Milton, and it was then conveyed to text by different assistants or amanuenses, as it's called.
mm,
Um, so this already at that point it becomes problematic to just look at it as a text that we read according to some our current or present day principles and how to deal with the text. Because when we start looking at the punctuation as guides to how it sounds, the poems really starts opening up in ways that we're going to explore in many ways throughout this course. But again, we can see that we have very long sentences. So we start from the top, and it doesn't end before we have pole with the red punctuation mark there.
mm,
And then we have a very short one, and this of course also creates a kind of rhetorical flair. But we're going to bring all of these things together one by one. Um, And what we're looking at here is, I should have introduced that first, is a very famous passage from the first book where when Satan is being thrown into hell, and Milton is describing what is this like, what is going on here. And we have the famous characterization that these flames, they produce no light, they show us darkness visible, and so on. Um, Another thing of taking Milton's text serious as something to be performed, something that is a piece of not just, in a sense, a poetry, but rhetoric, is Milton's very conscious use of what we call enjambment. Now, this is where the sense of the line doesn't end. When the line ends, it continues over to the next line. So we have a very good example of this. We have the middle one. So we have but torture without end, but then it continues with still urges. Um, this is something that Milton is quite fond of doing, because if we terminate the line properly, we have but torture without end, still urges. So the meaning is it's
mm,
still there, it still urges, but it's also lingering in the sound.
mm,
This effect is a bit easier to understand if we look at Milton's rhymed poetry, where we have exactly the same kinds of a decasyllabic lines, so with 10 syllables, so-called iambic pentameter. And this is from his famous elegy, Lycidas, by some seen as Milton's first masterpiece in English. And in Lycidas, we have to have the words bear and tear rhyming. And here, I think I should issue an historical note that the pronunciation of tear, in the sense that we produce when we cry, that pronunciation wasn't settled yet at this time. So you can compare it, you still have, most people in England would say year or something like that for a year, we have a high vowel, but you still have some would probably call quite posh English where you say yeah. You just pronounce it as a long monophthong, as we call it. And that's the same thing that's going on here. So bear and tear are actual rhymes. But what's happening here is that when we read the text, we have to make sure that we terminate bear and tear properly in order to keep the rhyme structure. And if there's anything Milton cared about in his poetry, it's the sound. And this is something that I will extensively cover
Mm.
in the course as we go further. But if we just read it in our modern day pronunciation, we can't just go, he must not float upon his watery bear unwept. We can't rhyme br with tear. We have to rhyme, he must not float upon his watery bear unwept, and welter to the parching wind without the mead of some melodious tear. So what's happening, the effect is created by when we terminate bear, lingering a bit on it because it's a rhyme word. We are in a sense sending the signal to the reader that the line is over. But then suddenly unwept is there still.
Mm.
And this is a very famous example of Milton's very evocative, emotional use of enjambment, because in this elegy he is lamenting a person that he knew. So that if we exaggerate the effect, it will be he must not float upon his watery bear unwept and welter to the parching wind and so on.
Mm.
So what I'm really trying to get the focus on is that enjambment is not simply just reading the line as if the line ending doesn't exist. That would be a way to read it that's completely at odds with how they saw the text at that time.
Hmm.
And the background and of the rhymed verse and the blank verse is also something that I'm dedicating a lot of attention to in the first lesson of the course to get the complete background there. But I could a kind of a small spoiler would be that the key to read Paradise Lost lies in rhymed poetry, because blank verse is not some kind of poetic prose that you read like prose just because it looks like it.
Right.
And you can say that Milton cared a lot about how it sounds, and he manipulates the text very much to do particular effects. And we could also look at at the bottom, because there we are breaking the horrid silence. Because if we say, "With bold words breaking the horrid silence," they're just reading it like prose. But if we say, for example, "And thence in heaven called Satan, with bold words breaking the horrid silence, thus began." So in the sense that by terminating words properly, when we come with breaking, we are literally breaking. In a sense, it's just because terminating words shows us that the end is over, the line is kind of over, but breaking in a sense. And Milton uses enjambment very much to this effect. I would say that's one of the most fundamental parts of his style, is his very careful use of enjambment. But we're going to put all this together in some passages in a bit. Um, um, Contrary to as I just talked, that there was a misunderstanding was very early established that Paradise Lost is some kind of poetic prose. You just read through it like some kind of prose work. Um, but when we look at the text, Milton is very often doing very much with the final words. They're not technically rhyming, but here he is playing with the final consonant. This is a trait that will reappear many times in Paradise Lost. We have fed, unconsumed, prepared, ordained, and so on. Um, and there are also uses of rhyme, actual rhymes in Paradise Lost, of which I'm dedicating an entire lesson to because it is a very fascinating topic in itself. And if we go back to the text in its bare nature,
Mm.
if we take, for example, one thing that may seem a bit strange to us today is that many words were pronounced quite differently in the poetic tradition of the 17th century, and also poetry were subjected to particular rules. Milton's teacher, Alexander Gill, at St. Paul's School in London, he even calls the poetic language a poetic dialect because of the way that it deviated. And we can and we can actually start looking at and uh, I'm going to start just reading it out in modern pronunciation, so to just focus on the rhythm. So if we just read it as prose, like a dungeon horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe. And you would actually have people reading Paradise Lost like that. Um, but if we stick to what we know and what I'm going to teach you about the background and the traditions that this kind of poetry comes out of. If we rather, instead of what I just read, say a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flame, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe. That sounds a bit more poetic, doesn't it?
It has a
Um,
kind of music to it.
there's a lot of music in Paradise Lost, and uh, that's one of the most important things that I want to teach to anyone taking this course is to unlock that music and hear that music. And but I want to say something. You might wonder, how do we know, for example, that Milton would say visible in this context, not just visible, right? And that would be a fair question. The short answer is that uh, many words that came into English, they came in from French or Latin. And when they started to be used in English, they were also stressed in the fashion of their original language because that's how the word had been heard.
Mm.
But over time, the words were re-stressed. A concrete example given by Milton's teacher in his book, Logonomia Anglica from 1621, is the word misery, for example. So you would say misery in normal speech, but in poetry, you would tend to do miser, a, even with a diphthong a sound at the end. And the background for that, you will know all about when you're done with the course, but it's connected to what's called the great vowel shift in
Wow.
English, whereby a sound that originally sounded like E becomes A and becomes I. So that the word like find in English would have been find, fiend, faint, and then find.
Mm.
So that's really what's going on. But Gill is very clear, so Alexander Gill, that this is a poetic usage. And uh, this this uh, this kind of poetry was seen as very far removed from ordinary speech. It was actually seen as second only to scripture, and they referred to it as a heroic verse in general.
Hmm.
And we even have elocutionists in the 18th century talking about how strict the rules are and how you have to pronounce things and read them out and so on. Um, One thing that you're also going to learn about in the course is there are many words that meant different things in Milton's time, but are almost never picked up by any editions of the poem because the editions they focus on the big things, the really big misunderstandings.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of nuance in the language. We can have one here, for example, and this would be a nuance but we can see, for example, it's these flames that produce no light. They produce darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe. The thing is that for Milton, discover meant something very different than for us. In our sense, discover is an action that you do. You're out searching for it. So it's almost like you would apply this light to look for and discover sights of woe. For Milton, this word simply means revealed and nothing more than that.
Is it like uncovering?
Exactly, because you
Yeah,
are discovering it.
right.
You're absolutely right. That's the original sense of the word. And there's but there's another thing about Milton and the tradition that he belonged to that also becomes very important for the sound of Paradise Lost. And I'm going to show you an example of that. Right. Sorry about that.
Right.
Here we are. Yes. Um, well, it goes without saying that Satan is mentioned quite a few times in Paradise Lost. He is one of the reasons that the poem is so famous. So it should kind of be important. How do we pronounce Satan? How did Milton pronounce Satan? And if we look at the general pronunciation at that time and just turn back the clock, we would expect Milton to have said Satan or something like that, but he did not. The learned class that Milton belonged to, when the words came from Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, they tended to choose pronunciations that were very close to the source languages. And Milton almost certainly pronounced it Satan and Satan. You could stress it. The reason for that is that in Hebrew it's Satan with the stress at the end, but in English, when the stress shifted, it becomes Satan. And we actually know that this was still the case for the learned elite in England in the late 18th century, as this fact was lamented by a writer called John Walker. He is most famous for a pronunciation dictionary he published in 1791. But he thought that English should be always be pronounced according to its own idiom.
Hmm.
So regardless of what it sounded like in the original language, in his opinion, in his time, it should be Satan. It should be analogous to every other word. But um, in Milton's circles, that's not what they did. And if we look at the sound, it's also a bit interesting. So if we just read the word Satan in the original pronunciation, so in thence in heaven, called Satan, with bold words, breaking the horrid silence, thus began. Satan began.
Mm.
And here's, of course, a very interesting double meaning in the sense that, yes, he starts speaking, breaking the horrid silence, but this is also the very moment that Satan begins.
Ah, Satan begin.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Paradise Lost is filled with these, let's call it sound bits, or I would call it a soundscape. But in many cases, we have to know the original pronunciation in order to see it, in order
Mm.
to deal with it, to grasp with it. And that's one of the things that we're going to have many opportunities to look at. But I could do,
It's quite philosophical as well to have Satan begin in speech, like when he begins to speak,
oh
uh,
yes.
as like because you often combine thought with language and maybe language with knowledge. So all the three are kind of related. So you make those kind of connections.
I think that you're very onto the what's going on here,
Hmm.
and of course in the really good annotated editions, and you can see that there are so many allusions to in not just the Bible to older sacred texts, and I think you're right on the money to use. But I thought that just I thought that I could read something in my own reconstructed pronunciation of Paradise Lost, which I spent quite a few years putting together because in order to do it, it's not enough to rely on the general phonology that we know of the time. We also have to know a lot about Milton, his
Hmm.
tradition. And the funny thing about Milton is that he's the only one of the really old poets that we know something about his pronunciation.
Yeah.
He pronounced the R very hard, so hard that it was commented on by a biographer.
Was it like a pirate R?
Like a Scottish R.
Um, there are some differences of opinion, but mine would be closer to a Scottish than the pirate, but not Scottish either.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
But I'll read. I'll just. There's some I could do all of these, but let's do some of the right.
Should
So
we
I'll
maybe
do.
should do you want to explain what you're going to read, or do you just want to read it?
Yeah. So I'm going to read at the end. So after, oh, how unlike the place from whence they fell.
Okay.
Well, I could, of course, do more than that as well. There's, I
But
could read it all.
yeah, maybe it would be a good thing to end with that. What do you think, Kenneth? Leave leave it on a cliffhanger. Would that be all right?
I,
Or do you want to, if you want to elaborate, then that's okay. I don't know what
uh, I could, no, I could do a little teaser at the end, maybe.
okay.
So there will be ample of opportunities to look at the Milton's probable pronunciation of the text. But if I just take, we just uh, we touched upon the two final lines, but they might have sounded something like, "And thence in heaven called Satan with bold horns, breaking the horrid silence, thus began." Something like that. And I may add that I'm a bit out of practice now from my own reconstruction, but I'm going to get that into shape before actually recording the lessons involving the bits. But I will say that it will sound very strange for people to begin with, and this is because the way I read it now, with the pronunciations like silence for silence or breaking for breaking, they have completely different connotations today than they had back then. Because
Hmm.
this would be very, very polite, very uppity London learned language. But today they strike us more as something from Ireland, from Scotland. And this is because the general pronunciation in London has changed a lot.
Mm.
And but I might say that more or less what Milton was in his class of people were using, we could call it a kind of precursor to RP, but it sounded very different.
Hmm.
I thought
And
I thought that pronunciation gave those lines a very uh, almost a chilling effect. It made them feel more frightening.
I personally think so too. But I've also when I look at the text, that's all I hear in my head
Mm.
because I've done this for years. But I do understand that getting used to how they probably sounded is a bit of a mouthful because usually when Paradise Lost is approached, it's through a current day RP. and so many things sounded quite. There are bigger things that sounded, but you also have these small things, like for example, how Milton would have said rather darkness, because for him those A's would have been short, so it would be rather darkness. They wouldn't be prolonged. That was a development that started to happen more in the 18th century. And not everyone liked the lengthening of these A's, like the John Walker I talked about, who wrote his famous pronunciation dictionary that for some time was synonymous with good breeding. So published in 1791, he literally wrote that pronouncing dance to dance, exactly like that, it borders on vulgarity because you're supposed to dance, not to dance, and so on.
Amazing. It's just a completely different relationship to language that people had, I think, right?
Yes, um, but of course, in Milton's London, very few people would have spoken like he did. I think you can compare it to London today. How many people really speak RP in London every day, as their everyday language? Um, so we do know a lot about how educated people spoke because that's what we have evidence of. Unfortunately, we mostly have evidence about ordinary people in London when people are chastising them for their pronunciations. This would be
Right.
like the John Walker I mentioned. That would be in the 18th century, of course. That if you have like a toast, the plural of that, we say toasts, and he would say toasts because the vowel shift hadn't really completed yet. But the vulgar, as he called them in London, they tended to pronounce it toastes in two syllables, which was one of the greatest abominations on earth, it seems, according to John Walker.
And on that note, I think, Kenneth, thank you so much for this wonderful window into how to even begin thinking about reading Paradise Lost.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So much you can just see
Yeah.
happening in the poem once you are just a little bit aware of just punctuation and commas. Yeah. And it really stands out like a musical
Mm.
composition,
Yeah.
and that kind of links it back with the ancient poems, the
Oh,
Homeric poems, which are also like voiced.
oh, absolutely, and which, of
So,
course, were Milton's greatest role models of all.
yeah,
If you were to be likened to someone, it would have to be to Homer or Virgil.
yeah.
He's very clear on that on many occasions.
Very clear. You're gonna compare me to someone, compare me to these guys.
Yes, that would be very much
Yeah. Thank you,
to
Kenneth.
his. Oh, my pleasure. It was all my pleasure.